As I listened to yet another lecture about money, the evening sun streamed warm gold across the tall windows of my parents' Manhattan living room. All my life, these lectures had taken place in this very apartment on the 15th floor of the Wellington. Mom was sitting exactly upright on her expensive Italian couch, and every element of the space was thoughtfully chosen to shout success. "I'm 30 years old and still living in a small rented studio downtown," she answered composedly. "When will you make an investment in something worthwhile?" I concealed a tiny smile as I raised my teacup. My place functions perfectly for me. "All right." Folding his financial newspaper, Dad sneered from his leather chair. "For crying out loud, you work in real estate, and you still don't have a respectable apartment." If only they were aware of the true nature of my work at Thompson Development Group, which I had discreetly founded 5 years prior. Mom proudly pointed around the room and said, "At least we own this. One of the city's most prestigious addresses is the Wellington. We made an early purchase of just $2 million. In my pocket, my phone began to vibrate. Another acquisition was completed. Without checking, I muted it. "How much rent is that shoebox costing you?" Dad applied pressure. "You might be establishing relationships, creating equity, and residing in a respectable area." I was about to explain. Mom interrupted me right away. "The apartment next door was purchased by the Hendersons, $7 million. That's what wise investing looks like." I looked at my timepiece. There was no better time to do it. "Speaking of investments, have you gotten the new ownership notice yet?" I said softly. Dad scowled. "What notice?" I opened my basic leather purse and said, "The Wellington changed ownership last month. It was intended to notify every resident." Mom yelled, "That's not possible. We are the original members." "That kind of stuff would never be approved by the board." "Well," I said, setting a heavy folder on her spotless coffee table. 3 weeks ago, the board cast its vote. There was a unanimous conclusion. In his hands, Dad's newspaper dropped a little. "Thompson Development," he murmured. "That business purchasing upscale structures throughout Manhattan." I gave a nod. "The identical one." I then clicked on the folder. "Are you interested in seeing the deed?" Mom looked at the paper and froze. There was silence in the room. There it was, unmistakable, formal, and obvious. The Wellington, each of the 35 floors. Thompson Development Group is the current owner. Olivia Thompson is a "This," Dad muttered, his voice cracking. "This must be a joke of some sort." At last I grinned. With shaky hands, Dad reached for the documents. "This building cannot possibly belong to you." "I do," I replied coolly, "as well as 12 other upscale homes throughout the city." The space became motionless. "You like to make fun of that little studio downtown," I went on. "It's not difficult. It's our development lab, where my team creates the luxury lifestyle of the future." Mom's flawlessly groomed hand sprang to her chest. "However, you frequently discuss how costly rent is." "Market research," I answered as I pulled out another stack of papers. I had to get a first-hand look at the rental market. I looked her in the eye. "I was stealthily purchasing the entire block while you were boasting about purchasing early for $2 million. As he looked over the documents, Dad's face turned pale. "Thompson Development Group," he muttered. I gave a single nod. "That's the company that just acquired the Plaza Hotel, Cameron Tower, the West Side Luxury Complex. I can also show you those deeds if you'd like." Mom's hand shook as she reached for her phone. Perhaps looking up the business she had just learned her financially irresponsible daughter. I allowed the quiet to linger. "Oh, and about the rent," I said nonchalantly. Dad swallowed hard and said, "As the new owner, I'm adjusting rates to reflect current market value. Sure. Increasing our rent." I pushed the new lease agreement across the table and confirmed, "By 40%. Your initial purchase was wise, but it does not ensure that you will always have preferred pricing. But don't worry," I said with a gentle smile. "I'm giving long-term residents a special consideration." I stopped and thought back to all the years I had spent listening to lectures about maturity and responsibility. But I might have to go over that policy. Outside, the sun began to set, casting shadows over the apartment they had once proudly ruled. Now that they realized their daughter wasn't the only owner of this flat, they sat still. The entire structure belonged to her, and the majority of the surrounding community. I stood up and remarked, "The updated lease begins next month. Oh, and your packet contains the renovation schedule." Mom slowly raised her head. Every unit is being upgraded to smart home systems, I continued. For the past year, my downtown studio has been testing them. I grabbed my bag. Olivia, Dad began. I gave one final smile. Mom's voice was barely audible as she muttered, "We advised you to invest in real estate all those years." "I did," I said coolly as I gathered my belongings. "I simply assumed it would be larger than a single apartment." I turned around one more time as I made my way to the door, which was now mine because I owned every square inch of the Wellington. "Oh, by the way," I said in passing, "the $7 million unit owned by the Hendersons. We are turning it into a communal work area for the locals." I grinned. To impress dinner guests, prime real estate shouldn't be left empty. Dad's newspaper fell out of his hands and onto the ground behind me. At last, reality set in. The following morning, panic was in the air in the marble lobby of the Wellington. The whole redevelopment plans of Thompson Development Group were displayed on a recently constructed digital announcement board, and residents gathered around it, looking in shock. Integration of smart homes, systems for sustainable energy, areas with a community focus. But what about our exclusivity? The polished stone reflected Mrs. Henderson's sobbing voice. I exited my own elevator, which had only been installed a week before, at that very moment. At first, nobody noticed. I was dressed in the same basic attire that my mother had made fun of the previous evening. There was silence in the lobby. "Good morning," I exclaimed with pleasure as I saw recognition appear on the faces of people who had before ignored me. "I hope that everyone has received their most recent lease agreements." Mrs. Henderson stumbled. "Olivia, you're the new owner, right?" "The exact same," I said, tapping the digital screen as the construction specifications appeared. "Our modernization project's first phase begins today." I grinned. The Wellington will soon be the first fully integrated smart luxury home in Manhattan. The room exploded. Someone yelled, "You're taking down the private fitness lounge." "Where are we going to hold our private yoga classes?" "In the rooftop wellness center," I said with a flawless transition of perspectives, "the one with vertical gardens and retractable glass walls." I looked at my mother, who had just emerged from the ordinary elevator, looking tired and pale. "You know, the sustainability project you once said was a waste of my time," I remarked softly. As Mom's friend slowly turned to face her, her face burned. She had written off my studies in environmental design as unrealistic dreams for years. But the exclusivity, Mrs. Henderson made another attempt. I quietly interrupted her, saying, "We're redefining it. Keeping people out is not the essence of true luxury." I gave the words time to settle. "It's about creating something meaningful." Calmly, I went on, "It's about creating spaces that actually improve lives." The Wellington will establish a new standard for eco-friendly luxury. Once more. My phone buzzed. One more warning. Overnight, 3 more buildings were added to the portfolio. The destination was never the Wellington. It was just the start. My helper handed me my customary cup and remarked, "Your coffee, Miss Thompson." The mayor's office then made a call. They want to talk about making the smart building program citywide. The lobby fell silent. Mom's neighbors suddenly realized how much they had undervalued her kid, and she grabbed her fancy purse as the knowledge swept over the room. I told the assembled residents, the renovation schedule is non-negotiable. However, first dibs on upgraded amenities will be given to those who sign the new lease early. I gave Mrs. Henderson a small smile, including the private sky gardens I created in my humble downtown studio. Shortly after, Dad emerged from the elevator, his assured gait pausing as he observed his neighbors and landlord. "Property values," he began. I concluded for him, Triple One's renovations are completed. We have received over 400% returns on our last 3 projects. I looked him in the eye. "Not bad for someone you said you would never be a property owner." A live broadcast of Thompson Development's properties throughout Manhattan replaced the digital board. Every structure was a reflection of my vision. Each is more valuable than the Wellington's inhabitants could have ever dreamed. Someone objected, "But we're founding members. We possess rights." I kindly corrected, "You have leases, and my company is holding them as of last month." I hesitated. Updated pricing may encourage some natural turnover, but I'm not planning to evict anyone. At last, Mom moved forward, her voice trembling. "Olivia, all those years we spent boasting about our $2 million apartment," I whispered, "you were concentrating on a unit. I was constructing an empire. She gave a slow nod. One is now worth more than all of the apartments in this building put together. As I opened up the final design solar systems disguised as architecture, vertical farms stitched into balconies, communal spaces rethinking what luxury meant, the marble floors reflected morning light. I checked the clock and said, "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with the City Planning Commission. We're talking about extending these ideas to all of Manhattan's upscale properties." "Why didn't you tell us?" Dad yelled softly as I turned to go. I hesitated. "Would you have thought your reckless daughter would grow up to be the biggest owner of upscale real estate in Manhattan?" Nobody responded. Real power doesn't often look the way you expect, as the occupants of New York's most exclusive address finally realized. After 3 months, I was standing inside the main exhibition unit of the Wellington, which was once my parents' apartment. As daylight faded, smart walls adjusted. Where their status balcony had been, a living garden thrived. Mom touched the greenery and said, "It's beautiful, very different from what we believed luxury to be." "That was the issue," I said, making a gesture to change the "You were gazing in the wrong direction. I was making progress." While hidden solar panels tracked the sun, Dad gazed out the window. He said, "The value's quadrupled." I also mentioned that there is a 3-year waiting list. I grinned and said, "It turns out that luxury isn't about exclusivity. Innovation is key." As night fell, the AI in the apartment muted the lighting. Each piece of furniture was more valuable than Mom's entire previous collection and was sustainable. At last, Dad said, "We were wrong." I showed them the most recent acquisition documents and said, "Not entirely. I learned how to invest in real estate from you." I grinned. "I simply made an investment in everything." Mom touched my arm as the sunset seeped through self-tinting glass. "So, are we still required to pay the new rent?" I chuckled quietly. "Obviously, but I'll accept your old apartment as partial payment." "For all those years of doubt," I said,